The smoke still clung to the air, a bitter shroud over what had once been a home. Ashes, gray and fine, covered everything, muffling the usual desert sounds, replacing them with a haunting, profound silence. There was no crackle of embers, no lingering warmth, only the cold, stark evidence of ruin. A single, broken fence post, charred and twisted, stood sentinel over the desolation, a grim finger pointing to the sky. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're here, drop a comment below with where you're listening from and the local time on your side of the prairie. It's always a joy to know how far these old tales travel. And this is how the trail turned bitter all those years ago. He coughed, a dry, rasping sound that tore at his throat, and the acrid taste of ash filled his mouth. He lay amidst the debris, a shadow among shadows, his body a map of pain. Jeremiah Stone. That had been his name, a name carved into the wooden sign that hung over the porch, now reduced to cinders. A name whispered by his dog, loyal beyond measure, but the dog was gone. The land, once a sprawling expanse of sun-baked earth and resilient scrub, was now a scorched wound. The silence pressed in, a heavy weight emphasizing the gaping hole where his life used to be. He pushed himself up, slowly, each movement a fresh agony. His hand, scraped and bleeding, found only splintered wood and cold ash. The sun, a brutal disk in the clear morning sky, seemed to mock his desolation, illuminating every detail of his loss. The cabin, his sanctuary, was a skeletal ruin. The small barn, where he kept his horse and a few head of cattle, was a charred husk. Nothing remained but the memory, vivid and searing, of the night they came. He tried to recall the precise moment, the faces, the words. It was all a blur of smoke and shouts, of brutal hands and a sudden, blinding pain. They had taken everything. His land, coveted for its proximity to a new railroad line being surveyed across the territories, a brutal fact of the late 19th century expansion, where individual land rights often fell prey to the larger ambitions of progress. They had taken his horse, his cattle, his meager savings, and they had taken his dog, Blue, a loyal coonhound with eyes like warm whiskey and a bark that could chase away any loneliness. Blue. The thought of his dog, terrified and alone, ignited a cold, hard flame in the pit of his gut, a stark contrast to the ashes that surrounded him. A deep, psychological conflict began to brew within him. The immediate urge was to simply lie down, to surrender to the crushing weight of loss and despair. But then, the image of Blue, his trusting eyes, his unyielding loyalty, flashed before him. To abandon Blue would be to abandon the last shred of his humanity, the last piece of the life they had built together. It was a choice between succumbing to utter defeat or finding a new, brutal purpose. He dragged himself towards the remains of his well, his thirst a raw ache in his throat. The bucket was gone, the rope frayed and broken. He leaned over the dark opening, the cool air rising, a stark reminder of life beneath the scorched surface. He scooped up a handful of muddy water, the taste of ash mingling with the metallic tang of earth. It was bitter, but it was life. As he drank, he surveyed the faint tracks left by the raiders. There were too many, he knew, to count accurately in his current state. Horses, heavy boots, the distinct scuff of something being dragged. They were professional, organized, not just common bandits. This was a deliberate act, a calculated dispossession. He remembered the frontier folklore of claim jumpers, ruthless individuals who would use any means necessary to seize land they deemed valuable, often resorting to violence and intimidation. He was not just a victim of random savagery. He was a casualty of expansion, a piece of Old West being swept aside by the relentless march of progress. His hand, trembling slightly, reached for the torn remnants of his shirt, a piece of scorched fabric clinging to his arm. He remembered his father, a stern but fair man who had taught him the importance of dignity, even in hardship. "A man ain't truly broken," his father had always said, "until he gives up his name and forgets his purpose." They had taken his land, his dog, his home. but they had not taken his name. Not yet. And his purpose now was clear: to find Blue, and then to make them pay. The very air around him, once thick with despair, now held a sharp, cold edge of resolve. The silence was no longer a shroud, but a cloak for his unwavering determination. A faint tremor, not of the earth but of memory, rippled through Jeremiah. He knelt amidst the still smoldering ruins of his cabin, the acrid scent of burnt timber clinging to his clothes. The sun, now a brazen eye in the sky, beat down relentlessly, illuminating the devastation. This was the place where he had built a life, brick by painstaking brick, year by quiet year. This was his ranch, his little corner of the world, nestled just beyond the furthest reach of established towns like dusty Dodge City or the burgeoning railhead at Cheyenne. He had chosen this solitude deliberately, seeking a peace far removed from the clamor of the burgeoning cattle towns and the relentless push of civilization. He remembered the rhythm of those days, the lowing of his small herd at dawn, the creak of the well pump, the rhythmic thud of his axe splitting firewood. He had been content, a man carved from the same stoic, enduring rock as the land itself. His only companion had been Blue, the scruffy coonhound he'd found as a pup, shivering in a ditch during a late spring blizzard. Blue had grown into a loyal shadow, his intelligence shining in his warm brown eyes, his companionship a silent comfort against the vast loneliness of the prairie. Their days were simple, defined by the turning of the seasons and the needs of the ranch. Jeremiah would spend hours mending fences, tending to his few head of cattle, or tracking errant strays across the unforgiving scrubland. Blue was always there, a whiskered nose nudging his hand, a soft whine of encouragement, or a playful nip at his boots. They hunted together, fished the shallow streams, and sat by the fire on crisp evenings, the only sounds the crackle of burning mesquite and the distant howl of coyotes. Jeremiah had read somewhere, perhaps in an old newspaper, about the deep bond between frontier folk and their working dogs, how these animals were often more than just companions. They were extensions of the family, vital for survival. He remembered a particular afternoon, clear and bright, when he and Blue had been fixing a broken section of fence near the southern property line. The sun had been warm on their backs, the air still. Blue, usually so focused, had suddenly tensed, his ears swiveling, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Jeremiah had looked up, following the dog's gaze, but saw nothing but the shimmering heat haze distorting the distant horizon. "What is it, boy?" he'd murmured, patting Blue's head. The dog had whined, a sound of unease, then pressed closer, his body rigid. Jeremiah, dismissing it as a deer or a coyote, had shrugged it off. But Blue's unease had been a premonition, a quiet warning from a creature more attuned to the land's subtle shifts than any man. This memory now sparked a bitter remorse. He had been blind, too caught up in his quiet contentment to see the encroaching shadow. The land, though vast, was shrinking, carved up by ambitious railroad barons and land speculators. The government's Homestead Act of 1862, intended to encourage settlement, often led to conflicts over land ownership, as powerful interests sought to exploit loopholes or simply push out smallholders. Jeremiah, with his simple deed and his quiet life, was an inconvenient obstacle. A deep psychological conflict twisted within him, the yearning for his lost peace versus the burning desire for retribution. He had always been a man of quiet honor, slow to anger, quick to forgive. But what had happened here transcended mere anger. It was a violation so profound it seemed to scorch his very soul. The cultural belief of the frontier spirit often romanticized the self-reliant, peaceful homesteader. But the reality, as Jeremiah now understood, was that this peace was fragile, easily shattered by the ruthless ambition of others. He ran a hand over the charred remains of his workbench, where he had carved small wooden animals for the children of the nearest settlement. A rare indulgence, a glimpse into the gentler side of a man who rarely showed emotion. Blue had always watched him work, his head tilted, his eyes curious. The thought of those hands, now stained with ash and scraped with ruin, reaching for Blue, filled him with a cold fury. He rose, his gaze hardening. The peace was gone. It had been taken from him, along with his home, his name, and his dog. But the quiet man who loved his ranch and his hound was not all he had been. There was a deeper current to Jeremiah Stone, a history buried beneath layers of ordinary life, a training that had forged an unyielding will. They had taken much, but they had left him with a purpose, sharp and unwavering. The sun climbed higher, casting long, stark shadows across the wasteland, and Jeremiah, his name now just a memory, began to walk, his eyes fixed on the distant horizon, searching for a single, loyal set of tracks. A sudden gust of wind, smelling of ash and distant rain, swept across the charred homestead, carrying with it phantom screams and the metallic tang of fear. Jeremiah flinched, not from the physical sensation, but from the brutal clarity of the memory it invoked. It had been a moonless night, the kind that swallowed stars when the riders arrived. They weren't a disorganized gang of rustlers. They moved with a chilling precision, their horses' hooves muffled by strips of rawhide, their faces obscured by bandanas. This was no random act of violence. It was a carefully orchestrated strike, a brutal frontier cleanup operation. He remembered the first loud crack of splintering wood as they kicked in his cabin door. The ensuing chaos was a blur of shouts, the sharp scent of kerosene, and Blue's frantic barks quickly turning into whimpers. Jeremiah had lunged forward, armed only with the axe he'd been sharpening by the fire, but a heavy blow to the head had sent him sprawling into the dirt, stars exploding behind his eyes. He lay there, half-conscious, watching the nightmare unfold. The men moved with brutal efficiency. They weren't after his meager savings, not primarily. They were after his presence, his claim. One man, a hulking figure with a cruel, wide jaw visible even in the dim light, held a flaming torch aloft. He strode through the cabin, setting fire to everything that would burn. The dry timber caught quickly, the flames licking hungrily at the walls, painting the night in grotesque dancing shadows. Jeremiah could hear the creak of his bed, the crash of his few possessions, the quiet destruction of his entire existence. He tried to rise, but another kick, sharp and precise, landed in his ribs, sending a searing pain through his side. "Stay down, old man," a voice snarled, rough and unfamiliar. "This ain't personal, just business." Business. The word hung in the smoky air, a vile justification for their savagery. This was the dark side of westward expansion, where the relentless pursuit of profit often crushed the rights of individual settlers, a stark reality often overlooked in the romanticized narratives of the frontier. The Dog Star, a Native American cultural belief sometimes associated with bad omens or the arrival of malevolent spirits, felt chillingly apt that night. Through the haze of pain, Jeremiah saw them drag Blue from the barn. The dog, usually so fierce, was struggling, whimpering, his loyalty twisting into desperate fear. The man with the cruel jaw yanked hard on the rope around Blue's neck, pulling him away from the burning cabin, away from Jeremiah. "Nice hound," the man grunted, a twisted smile on his face. "He'll make a fine hunting dog." This was the true horror, not just the destruction of his property, but the desecration of his bond with Blue, the cruel theft of a loyal companion. The psychological conflict within Jeremiah intensified, the crushing despair of witnessing such wanton cruelty, warring with the primal, burning need for retribution. He heard the man speak of railroad land, of speculators, and title deeds. They were clearing him out, extinguishing his claim to the land for some grander, more profitable scheme. It wasn't about a simple dispute. It was about power, about the relentless march of industry over the individual. They didn't even bother to deliver a formal eviction notice, a common, though often brutal tactic used by land companies to intimidate settlers. They simply burned him out, leaving nothing but ash and a broken man. The heat from the burning cabin intensified, licking at his skin. He felt the cold touch of a boot against his cheek, pressing his face into the dirt. "Remember this, old man," a voice hissed, chillingly close. "Forget your name. Forget this place. It never existed. You never existed." And then, a final crushing blow, plunging him into darkness. He woke hours later, the sun already high, the air thick with the smell of ruin. His ribs ached with every breath, his head throbbed, and his heart felt like a lump of lead. But the memory of Blue, whimpering, being dragged away, burned through the pain, a searing, relentless ember. They had taken his land, his home, and his name. But they had not taken the burning image of his dog and the unyielding purpose that now filled the empty spaces within him. The moral imperative to find Blue, to reclaim that last vestige of his life, superseded all else. He pushed himself to his feet, swaying slightly. The ground was cold beneath his bare feet, the ash clinging to his skin. He was Jeremiah Stone no more. He was simply a man, stripped of everything, left with only a burning desire to reclaim what was stolen. And in that desire lay the terrifying cold promise of his hidden training. A cold wind, carrying the scent of distant rain that promised no relief for the parched earth, stirred the ashes around Jeremiah. His body screamed in protest with every strained breath, each movement a testament to the brutal beating he'd endured. Yet, a deeper pain, an emotional wound far more agonizing than any physical injury, spurred him forward. The image of Blue, dragged away, whimpering. They had stripped him of everything tangible, but the unyielding tether of loyalty to his dog remained, a burning ember in the desolate landscape of his loss. He stumbled through the debris, his bare feet crunching on burnt fragments of his life. His eyes, though swollen and bloodshot, were fixed on the faint impressions in the ash, the distinct prints of a man's boot and, crucially, the familiar paw prints of Blue. The dog's prints were not uniform. There was a slight dragging motion in one, a subtle sign of injury or distress. A fresh wave of cold fury washed over Jeremiah, chilling him more effectively than the biting wind. They had hurt his dog. The raiders, in their arrogant haste, had underestimated his resilience, believing they had left him for dead. But in the harsh realities of the frontier, where survival often hinged on a sheer refusal to yield, such assumptions could be fatal. The concept of rough justice was a common understanding in these untamed lands, where the absence of formal law enforcement often meant individuals took matters into their own hands. Jeremiah was now operating under that ancient code. He followed the tracks, his movements stiff but determined. The sun, a brutal eye in the cloudless sky, began its slow ascent, casting long, distorted shadows of his broken form. The psychological conflict within him was immense. The temptation to collapse, to surrender to the overwhelming pain and loss, battled against the fierce, unyielding drive to rescue Blue. To give up now would be to betray the creature who had given him unconditional love, to break the last remaining bond of his shattered world. The tracks led away from the homestead, heading roughly east towards the distant low hills that marked the beginning of a vast, uninhabited stretch of wilderness. It was a route that offered few water sources and even fewer signs of civilization. These men were clearly trying to disappear, to vanish into the emptiness, but Jeremiah knew the desert, not just as a place of hardship, but as a book of subtle signs, a canvas where every passing creature left its indelible mark. He reached a cluster of prickly pear cactus, their broad pads shimmering green against the desolate earth. Here, the tracks became clearer, less obscured by ash. He knelt, examining them closely. Blue's paw print showed a distinct drag, not just from the left forepaw, but also a deeper impression from the right hind paw. He had been injured, or perhaps limping from being dragged. Jeremiah's jaw clenched, a knot of icy resolve tightening in his gut. A small, peculiar detail caught his eye, a single blue feather caught on a thorny branch of the cactus. It was a jay feather, vibrant against the drab landscape. Blue, in his playful moments, would sometimes chase jays, his barks echoing across the prairie. Jeremiah knew it was a coincidence, a random occurrence in the vastness of the desert, but to his raw, aching heart, it felt like a silent message, a fragile thread connecting him to his lost companion. The cultural belief of animal spirit guides, while more commonly found in Native American traditions, sometimes resonated with solitary frontiersmen who spent their lives deeply intertwined with the natural world. He moved on, his pace slow but relentless. His thirst grew, a burning ache in his throat, but he pushed it down. Food was a distant memory. He was running on pure will, on the fuel of a love that transcended even the destruction of his own life. The moral imperative to find Blue, to ensure his safety, was a blazing beacon in the darkness of his despair. It was the only thing that mattered. He remembered a conversation with an old trapper years ago, a grizzled veteran of countless winters who spoke of the spirit of the West. "It ain't about being strong, boy," the trapper had rasped, spitting tobacco juice into the dust. "It's about being stubborn, about refusing to lay down when everything tells you to." Jeremiah, then a young rancher, had nodded, not fully understanding. Now he understood. He was stubborn. He would not lay down, not while Blue was out there. The sun climbed higher, beating down with a renewed intensity. The heat shimmered off the land, creating optical illusions that made the distant hills dance. Jeremiah felt a peculiar detachment, as if his body was merely a vessel, driven by an unyielding will. His physical pain was a dull throb, secondary to the sharp, clear focus of his purpose. He was no longer Jeremiah Stone, the rancher. He was simply the tracker, following a faint, loyal trail driven by a love that would not break, even in the face of absolute ruin. A searing pain lanced through Jeremiah's ribs with every step, a brutal reminder of the beating he'd taken. Yet, amidst the agony, a different kind of sensation began to prick at his consciousness, a deep, almost forgotten rhythm in his bones, a memory of muscles strained to their breaking point, of breath controlled and mind sharpened. It was the echo of another life, one buried beneath years of quiet ranching, a life defined by rigorous discipline and the cold, unyielding demands of military service. He had enlisted young, barely 18, during the tail end of the Civil War, not for glory, but for a paycheck, for a chance to escape the crushing poverty of his youth. The war had raged from 1861 to 1865, a brutal conflict that scarred a generation. Jeremiah, however, had found himself in a unique unit, a small, specialized detachment of scouts operating on the western frontier, tasked with tracking and disrupting Confederate supply lines and raiding parties, often venturing deep into Indian territory. This was a time when the U.S. Army frequently used frontier-hardened individuals, often former plainsmen or even Native American scouts, whose skills in tracking and wilderness survival far outstripped those of conventional soldiers. His drill sergeant, a man named Sergeant Elias Grim Stone, was a relic of an older, harder army. Grim was a legend, whispered to have fought in the Mexican-American War, a man whose eyes held the weary wisdom of countless campaigns. He believed in breaking a man down to build him back stronger, stripping away all softness, all hesitation. "You ain't nothing but a piece of soft clay, boy," Grim would bellow, his voice like grinding stones as Jeremiah struggled through endless drills under the scorching Texas sun. "I'm going to mold you into iron, or you'll break." Jeremiah remembered endless forced marches, miles covered with little water, little food, his feet raw and bleeding, his body screaming for rest. He remembered being taught to move silently through any terrain, to read the faintest sign, a broken twig, a disturbed pebble, a subtle shift in the wind. Grim had methods that bordered on the cruel, forcing his recruits to track blindfolded, relying solely on sound and scent, or to navigate dense wilderness at night, guided only by the stars and an innate sense of direction. He taught them to be invisible, to become part of the landscape. "The enemy ain't just the man with the gun," Grim would rasp, his eyes glinting in the firelight. "The enemy is hunger. The enemy is thirst. The enemy is doubt. You conquer them, boy, and you conquer everything." There was a particular exercise, one that haunted Jeremiah even now. Grim would leave them sometimes for days in unforgiving terrain with minimal supplies, forcing them to find their way back, to hunt for food, to distill water, to survive using only their wits and their training. It was a brutal test of resilience, of resourcefulness, and of the profound psychological conflict between the will to live and the urge to surrender. Many broke. Jeremiah never did. He learned to listen to his body, not its cries of pain, but its subtle signals, its hidden reserves of strength. He learned to trust his instincts, to quiet the fear, to make decisions with a chilling, almost detached clarity. This rigorous training, deeply rooted in the realities of frontier warfare where survival often depended on individual prowess rather than overwhelming force, had instilled in Jeremiah an unyielding discipline, a mental fortitude that few possessed. He had carried it with him, dormant, through his years as a rancher, never needing to unleash its full potential. Until now. The memory of Grimm's face, stern and unyielding, overlaid the scorching heat of the present. They had stripped him of everything, those raiders, but they had left him with the very tools he needed for retribution. His body might be broken, but his mind, honed by Grimm's relentless instruction, was sharp, calculating. The raw data of the tracks before him, the drag of Blue's paw, the scuff of a heavy boot, were not just signs. They were a language he understood intimately. The moral conflict that had once been a battle between succumbing to despair and seeking revenge now sharpened into a singular, undeniable purpose. This wasn't just about getting Blue back. It was about reclaiming himself, the man Grimm had forged, the man who refused to be broken. The sun beat down, turning the horizon into a shimmering mirage, but Jeremiah saw only the path ahead, clear and unwavering. The tracker, long buried beneath the rancher, was now fully awake, and he would not rest until every debt was paid. The sun climbed higher, relentless and unforgiving, baking the already parched earth into a cracked, brittle crust. The faint drag marks of Blue's injured paw became Jeremiah's singular focus, a lifeline in the vast, indifferent expanse. His body, protesting with every movement, was now merely a vessel for his unyielding will. He was no longer Jeremiah Stone, rancher. He was the hunter, stripped bare, relying on a set of skills honed in a crucible of forgotten campaigns, a training that had branded itself onto his very soul. He moved with a peculiar, almost unnatural silence, a ghost traversing the scorched landscape. His eyes, trained by Grimm to see what others missed, scanned the ground not just for obvious tracks but for the subtle disturbances that spoke volumes. A bent blade of grass, a displaced pebble, a faint sheen of oil on a rock where a rifle had rested. These were the whispers of his quarry, the breadcrumbs of their passing. This meticulous attention to detail was a hallmark of military scouting, particularly vital in the sparsely populated and often hostile Western territories during the latter half of the 19th century, where intelligence was gathered through observation rather than formal reports. The raiders, in their arrogant assumption of his demise, had been careless. They had not taken the time to obscure their trail, believing the vastness of the desert and Jeremiah's supposed death would hide their movements. This overconfidence was their first mistake, a fatal flaw in their otherwise brutal efficiency. Jeremiah knew the frontier folklore of the desert ghost, a man or beast so attuned to the land that they could vanish without a trace. But these men were no ghosts. They were flesh and blood, and they left a trail he could follow. He stopped at a small, rocky outcrop where the ground became harder, less yielding. Here the tracks were fainter, but still discernible. He knelt, his fingers tracing the impressions. A horse had scuffed its hoof here, and near it, a boot print, heavy and deep, with a distinctive pattern on the sole. He committed it to memory, a silent promise. This wasn't just about finding Blue, it was about confronting the men who had shattered his world. The moral conflict of righteous retribution versus cold-blooded revenge simmered within him, a complex brew in the crucible of his loss. He found a discarded tobacco pouch, half empty, lying near a clump of mesquite. It was made of cheap leather, crudely stitched. Jeremiah sniffed it, a faint scent of stale pipe tobacco mingled with something else, something metallic. He crushed a pinch of the tobacco between his fingers. It was a common, low-grade blend, but the metallic scent was distinct. Lead. One of them had been cleaning a bullet, perhaps, or reloading a spent casing. A small, insignificant detail to anyone else, but to Jeremiah it was a piece of their identity, a thread connecting them to the violence they had wrought. He imagined Blue somewhere ahead, perhaps whimpering, perhaps defiant, his loyal heart beating with fear and confusion. The thought fueled his aching muscles, pushing him past the limits of physical endurance. Thirst gnawed at him, his throat raw and parched. He searched for water, scanning the subtle dips in the terrain that might indicate a hidden spring or a seasonal runoff. He remembered Grimm's relentless lessons on water procurement in arid environments, how to find moisture in surprising places, even in the morning dew collected on rocks. This practical knowledge, born of survival in harsh military campaigns, was now his lifeline. He found a small patch of damp earth beneath an overhang, a meager seep, barely enough to wet his tongue. He pressed his face to the cool ground, sucking the moisture, a desperate, animalistic act. It wasn't enough to quench his thirst, but it was enough to keep him moving. He was relying on the innate resilience of the human body, a concept often explored in early medical texts of the frontier, where harsh conditions tested human limits. As the sun began its slow descent, casting long, distorted shadows across the vast plains, Jeremiah saw something in the distance, a faint shimmer, almost like a mirage. It wasn't water. It was the glint of metal, perhaps a discarded tin, or a piece of glass, reflecting the dying light. It was a small, insignificant detail, but it told him he was closer, that the raiders were not as far ahead as he had feared. He would keep moving, relentlessly, his purpose unwavering. They had taken his land, his dog, and his name, but they had not taken his training, and that, he knew, would be their undoing. The long hunt had truly begun. The setting sun dipped below the horizon, painting the vast canvas of the sky in hues of fiery orange and bruised purple, a stark counterpoint to Jeremiah's internal landscape of pain and relentless determination. The metallic glint he had spotted was indeed a discarded tin, a small, insignificant piece of refuse, yet to Jeremiah it was a confirmation, a testament to the raiders' casual disregard for the land and their overconfidence. His ribs throbbed with a dull, constant ache, and his throat was raw, but the thought of Blue, injured and held captive, was a relentless spur driving him forward. He moved through the twilight, a shadow among shadows, his senses heightened, acutely attuned to the subtle shifts of the desert night. The air grew cooler, carrying the faint earthy scent of creosote and the dry dust of the trail. The tracks, though harder to discern in the fading light, were still there, a thin line of purpose leading him deeper into the unknown. His military training, particularly in night operations and silent movement, became his most potent weapon. He remembered Grimm's chilling pronouncements on the psychological effect of unseen forces. "The enemy you can't see," Grimm had barked, "is the enemy that breaks a man's spirit." The psychological toll of the chase was beginning to weigh on Jeremiah. His mind, unburdened by sleep or sustenance, began to replay the horrific events of the fire, the sounds, the smells, the image of Blue being dragged away. A burning rage, cold and clear, mixed with a profound sense of loss. He envisioned confronting the men, making them pay for every single wrong. But then, a flicker of a memory, of his father's gentle hand on his shoulder, his voice saying, "Revenge is a bitter meal, son. It fills you, but it leaves you empty." This was his moral conflict. The raw, visceral desire for retribution warring with the quieter, more profound yearning for restoration, for the simple peace he had lost. Was he seeking justice, or merely a darker reflection of their brutality? The cultural belief in the eye for an eye justice, a harsh but often necessary code in the untamed West, resonated deeply, yet the ghost of his father's gentler wisdom provided a counterpoint. He pushed the thought aside. First, he would find Blue. Then, he would decide what kind of man he truly was. He found a small, sheltered alcove beneath an overhang, a natural shelter from the biting night wind. Here, the tracks were fresh, indicating the raiders had paused, perhaps to rest or to water their horses. He found the faint, residual scent of horse sweat and stale campfire smoke. He also found something else, a small, flattened piece of rawhide, chewed at the edges, still retaining a faint scent of dog. Blue. He hadn't imagined it. Blue had been dragged here, and he was still alive. A surge of desperate hope, sharp and painful, coursed through Jeremiah. It was a fragile thing, easily crushed, but it fueled his resolve. He knelt, examining the rawhide. The teeth marks were Blue's, distinctive, a familiar pattern from years of chewing on discarded bones and scraps of leather. This wasn't just a sign, it was a connection, a desperate plea from his loyal companion. He scanned the immediate area, looking for any other sign Blue might have left, any desperate attempt to communicate. He recalled Grimm's lessons on silent signals, how scouts would leave subtle markers for their comrades to follow: a bent branch, a specific rock arrangement, a disturbed patch of moss. Blue, an exceptionally intelligent dog, might have understood such a concept, if only instinctively. He found a faint, shallow scratch on a smooth rock face, barely visible in the dim light. It was not a natural mark. It was too deliberate, too sharp. He traced it with his finger. It looked like a claw mark, perhaps Blue's desperate attempt to gain purchase as he was dragged away. Or perhaps a deliberate message. The cultural belief that animals could possess profound intelligence, even cunning, was widespread among frontier folk who relied on them daily for survival. The air grew colder as the night deepened. The stars, countless and impossibly bright in the clear desert sky, seemed to mock his solitary struggle, his tiny, desperate quest against overwhelming odds. But Jeremiah felt a grim satisfaction. They had taken his land, his dog, his name, but they had not broken his will, and they had not erased the training that now guided his every step. He would follow this faint, desperate trail, and he would reclaim what was his, no matter the cost, no matter the darkness he had to embrace. A sliver of moon, barely a crescent, rose above the jagged peaks, casting a thin, ghostly light over the desolate landscape. Jeremiah moved through the darkness, his steps almost preternaturally silent, guided by the whispers of the wind and the faint, persistent scent of his dog. The rawhide scrap, chewed and discarded, had been a lifeline, a desperate confirmation that Blue was still alive. Now, as the night deepened, he sought another sign, a flicker of hope in the vast, unforgiving emptiness. His vision, honed by years of traversing the wilderness, picked out subtle nuances in the gloom. A faint scrape on a rock face, a disturbed patch of dust near a thorny bush. These were the fleeting signatures of Blue's struggle, the silent pleas of a loyal heart. Jeremiah recalled Grimm's words, hammered into him during endless, grueling drills. "The wilderness speaks, boy, but only to those who truly listen. Every broken branch, every displaced stone tells a story." This philosophy of reading the environment was crucial for military scouts operating in the vast, unmapped territories of the American frontier, where maps were scarce and survival depended on interpreting natural signs. He found it near a dry wash, partially obscured by a tumbleweed. A small, crude knot of thin rope, likely a piece of the lead used to drag Blue, snagged on a sharp rock. It was not just a piece of rope, it was a defiant act. Tied to it, almost invisible in the dark, was a small, tightly woven braid of horsehair. It was a pattern Jeremiah recognized instantly. Blue, in his boundless energy, had often chewed on the horses' tails, pulling out strands of hair. Jeremiah had playfully braided some into a small, decorative charm and tied it to Blue's collar years ago, a quirky habit. This wasn't accidental. This was deliberate. Blue had left him a sign. A wave of profound emotion, raw and overwhelming, washed over Jeremiah. It was a potent cocktail of relief, hope, and a burning, righteous fury. Blue was injured, he knew, likely from being dragged, but he was still thinking, still fighting, still communicating. The intelligent, loyal creature was leaving a trail for his master, a testament to a bond that transcended even the brutal realities of captivity. This profound connection between a man and his animal, a recurrent theme in Western folklore, often spoke of an almost spiritual understanding that defied logical explanation. The psychological conflict that had nagged at Jeremiah, the internal debate between yielding to despair or pursuing a perilous quest for retribution, now solidified into unyielding determination. Blue's small, desperate signal had extinguished any lingering doubt. He was not just tracking a lost animal, he was following a beacon of loyalty, a silent plea that demanded unwavering response. His purpose, once vague and consumed by pain, was now sharp, clear, and utterly undeniable. He knelt, his fingers tracing the horsehair braid, a silent vow passing his lips. "I'm coming, boy. I'm coming." The raiders, oblivious to the intelligence of their captive, had underestimated not just Jeremiah, but also the creature they had stolen. They were moving steadily eastward, their trail becoming more defined as they moved into less rocky terrain. Jeremiah surmised they were heading for a temporary hideout, a staging post before moving their stolen goods and their stolen dog further away. The cattle towns, once symbols of progress, were now centers of illicit trade for stolen livestock, and these raiders would likely be selling off the herd. He moved faster now, his body pushing through the pain, fueled by this renewed hope. The night air was still, save for the faint whisper of the wind through the tall prairie grass. He heard the distant hoot of an owl, a lonesome sound that often brought comfort, but tonight it felt like a silent witness to his grim resolve. The stars, countless and impossibly bright, seemed to illuminate his path, a celestial guide in the vast wilderness. Jeremiah imagined Blue, perhaps tied up, perhaps limping, his spirit undaunted. He pictured the moment of their reunion, the frantic wag of Blue's tail, the happy barks, the warmth of his matted fur. That vision became his shield against the cold, the hunger, the gnawing ache in his ribs. They had taken his land, his home, his name, but they had not broken the bond with his dog, and that bond, he knew, would be their ultimate undoing. The hunter was closing in, guided by a loyalty as fierce and unyielding as the untamed land itself. A sliver of moon, no more than a sliver of forgotten bone, cast long, distorted shadows across the desolate landscape. Jeremiah, moving with the preternatural silence of a desert predator, felt the shift in the wind, a subtle change in temperature that told him he was close. The raiders, emboldened by their perceived triumph, had grown careless, their campfire a distant, flickering beacon in the vast darkness. This was his chance, the first move in a silent war for reclamation. He approached the camp with the stealth of a phantom. His military training, particularly in infiltration and reconnaissance, kicked into high gear. He recalled Grimm's mantra: know your enemy, know his habits, his weaknesses, then strike where he least expects it. This wasn't about a direct confrontation, not yet. It was about sowing doubt, creating chaos, and making them feel the creeping tendrils of an unseen threat. The psychological impact of such tactics, employed by scouts in numerous historical conflicts, was often as devastating as any physical blow. He found their horses first, tethered in a makeshift corral near a small, dry gulch. There were half a dozen of them, well-fed but nervous, sensing an alien presence in the still night. Jeremiah counted them, his mind working with chilling precision. 6 horses, meaning at least 6 men. He had seen 4 on his property, but the others must have been guarding the herd. His heart hammered a steady rhythm against his ribs, a drumbeat of grim resolve. He moved among the horses, his touch light, reassuring. He checked their tack, their hooves, searching for Blue. He didn't see him. A fresh wave of anxiety, cold and sharp, washed over him, but he pushed it down. Blue was here. He had to be. He found a discarded blanket, still bearing the faint scent of horse and dog. It wasn't Blue's usual scent, but it was unmistakably canine. His gaze flickered to the raiders' camp. They were huddled around a small fire, their voices low, punctuated by occasional bursts of rough laughter. They were celebrating their victory, reveling in the destruction they had wrought. The cruel-jawed man who had dragged Blue away was among them, his silhouette unmistakable. Jeremiah's eyes narrowed, a cold fire igniting in their depths. He wasn't aiming for a direct strike. Not yet. His target was their horses. Without their mounts, their advantage of mobility would be crippled, their ability to escape severely hampered. This was a classic tactic in frontier warfare, where horses were a vital asset, often determining the outcome of skirmishes and pursuits. The Apache, among other tribes, often targeted horses in raids to cripple their enemies. He chose a single horse, a sturdy bay with a nervous twitch. He approached it slowly, his hand outstretched, whispering soothing words. Then, with a practiced motion, he expertly cut the cinch strap on its saddle, loosening it just enough to be unnoticed in the dark, but enough to cause a nasty spill if ridden at speed. He repeated the action on 2 more horses, focusing on the ones that seemed the most spirited. He then cut their picket lines, not entirely but just enough to fray so they'd break with a hard tug. The moral conflict weighed heavily. Was he becoming like them? Using cunning, deception, and destruction to achieve his aims? He recalled his father's words about honor, about facing a man head-on, but these men were not honorable. They had burned his home, taken his dog, stripped him of his name. Honor, in this desolate landscape, felt like a luxury he could no longer afford. Survival, and Blue, demanded a different kind of justice. As he finished, he noticed a distinctive horseshoe print near the edge of the corral. It had a unique notch in the heel. He remembered seeing that same print on his own land, near where they had dragged Blue away. It belonged to the cruel-jawed man's horse. A small, cold smile touched Jeremiah's lips. The web was tightening. He moved silently away from the corral, melting back into the darkness, leaving no trace of his presence. He circled wide, heading for the camp itself, but not to attack. He needed to make them truly unsettled, to inject a seed of doubt and paranoia into their arrogant hearts. He needed to make them realize that the wilderness, far from being empty, held a silent, watchful presence. The frontier folklore of night riders and unseen avengers, though often exaggerated, was rooted in the very real fear of such encounters. He found a small pile of their saddlebags, carelessly tossed near the edge of the firelight. He rummaged through one, his fingers quick and silent. He found a small flask of whiskey, a pouch of tobacco, and a deck of greasy playing cards. He removed a single card, the ace of spades, often considered a death card in many cultures, and carefully placed it face up on top of the flask, a stark, silent message left for them to find in the morning. He then emptied the whiskey, pouring it onto the ground near the saddlebags, letting the potent scent mingle with the campfire smoke. A small act, seemingly insignificant, but designed to fuel their paranoia, to make them wonder who had been so close and what else might have been done. He retreated, leaving them to their uneasy slumber. The stars above shimmered, a million pinpricks of light in the vast, indifferent sky. Jeremiah, now a shadow, continued his stalk, his mind clear, his purpose unwavering. They had taken his land, his dog, and his name. But they had not taken his training, and they had not taken his patience. And patience, he knew, was a weapon that could break the strongest of wills. The first sliver of dawn, a faint gray bleed across the eastern sky, found Jeremiah perched on a high ridge overlooking the raiders' camp. The chill of the pre-dawn air bit at his exposed skin, but he barely registered it. His focus was absolute, his senses honed to a razor's edge. He watched as the men stirred, their movement sluggish, sleep still clinging to them like the morning dew. The small fire, reduced to glowing embers, cast a faint, flickering light on their faces, revealing them to him for the first time. The man with the cruel, wide jaw, the one who had dragged Blue away, was the first to fully rouse. He stood, stretching, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the nascent light. As he turned, Jeremiah saw his face clearly, scarred, hard, and devoid of any softness. A thin, almost invisible scar ran from his right temple down to his jawline, a testament to past skirmishes. His eyes, even from this distance, seemed to hold a cold, calculating gleam. This was the man who had ordered the burning, who had taken Blue. Jeremiah's grip tightened on the worn leather of his empty canteen, a silent promise of retribution. This unmasking of his enemy added a searing, personal dimension to Jeremiah's quest. It was no longer just about the abstract injustice. It was about specific faces, specific acts of cruelty. The moral conflict deepened, pushing him closer to the precipice of pure vengeance. His father's gentle lessons about forgiveness warred with the primal urge to inflict pain, to make these men suffer as he had suffered. The frontier, after all, was a land where personal scores were often settled outside the bounds of any official law, a stark reality that fed into the cultural myth of the lone avenger. The cruel-jawed man, whose name Jeremiah still didn't know, walked towards the corral. He stopped abruptly, his posture stiffening. He looked down, then knelt, examining the ground. Jeremiah watched, a grim satisfaction settling in his gut. The man found the cut cinches, the frayed picket lines. His head snapped up, his eyes sweeping the surrounding landscape, searching for any sign of the unseen intruder. His expression shifted from arrogance to a mix of confusion and dawning suspicion. "What in the blazes?" he muttered, loud enough for Jeremiah to hear the faint sound of his voice. He then noticed the ace of spades still resting on the empty flask near the saddlebags. He picked it up, his brow furrowing. Then his eyes widened slightly as he processed the subtle, unsettling message. This small, almost theatrical gesture was a peculiar detail, designed to unnerve, to create the illusion of an unseen, perhaps supernatural, presence. The card, a symbol of death and ill fortune, resonated with the superstitious undercurrents of frontier life, where signs and omens held significant weight. "Boys, wake up! We got company!" the man bellowed, his voice raw with a sudden, urgent anger. The other raiders stirred, grabbing their rifles, their sleep-addled confusion quickly replaced by wary alertness. One of them, a lanky man with a nervous twitch, found the empty whiskey flask, its potent scent still clinging to the ground. "Someone was here," he whispered, his eyes wide. "They spilled the whiskey." Silas, as Jeremiah now knew him from the trapper's earlier babblings, barked orders, his authority regaining some of its usual bite. "Fan out! Check the perimeter. We got a tracker on our tail, and they ain't friendly." He didn't know who was tracking them, but he knew they were methodical, cunning, the cold logic of a military man recognizing the tactics of another. Jeremiah watched them scatter, their initial chaos slowly giving way to a more organized search. They were good, he grudgingly admitted, disciplined despite their villainy. They weren't mere thugs. They were seasoned professionals, likely veterans of various conflicts, both legal and illicit, a common enough occurrence in a post-war frontier overflowing with men hardened by violence. He studied Silas, memorizing every detail of his movements, his reactions. This man was the leader, the head of the snake. He needed to be dealt with first. The moral dilemma of taking a life, once a distant abstraction, was now a vivid, pressing reality. Could he pull the trigger, end a life, and still remain the man his father had raised? Or had that man already been burned away with his home? A faint whimper reached his ears, carried on a sudden gust of wind. It was faint, almost imperceptible over the commotion in the camp, but it was there. Blue. The sound came from behind the makeshift lean-to near a pile of discarded saddles. Jeremiah's heart leaped, a desperate, aching surge of relief. Blue was alive. He was close. The sight of Silas, still barking orders, his face a mask of furious determination, fueled Jeremiah's resolve. The psychological conflict within him resolved itself. His father's teachings, his moral compass, would guide his hand, not to random violence but to a focused, precise justice. They had taken his land, his dog, and his name, but they had not taken his training nor his purpose. And his purpose now was clear. Reclaim Blue, and then extinguish the flame of Silas's cruelty forever. The sun, fully risen, bathed the scene in a harsh, unblinking light, revealing every detail of the impending confrontation. The scent of stale campfire smoke, mingled with the dry, earthy smell of the desert, hung heavy in the air. Jeremiah, still hidden on the ridge, watched as Silas barked orders, sending his men fanning out, their rifles held high. The frantic energy in their camp was a stark contrast to his own cold, calculated stillness. He had them unsettled, paranoid, but now he needed to choose his next move. The whimpers of Blue, faint but undeniable, still echoed in his mind, a constant, agonizing reminder of his primary objective. He considered the options. A direct assault on the camp, while tempting in his rage, would be suicidal against 5 armed men. He was outnumbered, and while his training was formidable, it didn't make him invincible. He could try to pick them off one by one from a distance, using the rifle he carried, but that would alert the others immediately, turning the hunt into a desperate shootout. The moral conflict of his choices pressed in. Was it about immediate retribution, or a long-term strategy to ensure Blue's safety and, ultimately, his own survival? His gaze fell on the makeshift lean-to, where Blue was undoubtedly tied. It was a flimsy structure, offering little concealment, but guarded by one of Silas's men, a burly individual named Hank, whose attention seemed more fixed on the surrounding terrain than on his captive. Hank was a man of the frontier, accustomed to the harsh realities of life and death, but perhaps less familiar with the subtle cunning of a man fighting for his soul. Jeremiah remembered Grimm's relentless lessons on prioritizing objectives in a hostile environment. "You got 1 bullet, boy, and 2 targets," Grimm would rasp, his eyes glinting. "Which one saves your skin? Which one lets you walk away?" The lesson was always about the most effective, most efficient path to success, not necessarily the most satisfying one. This cold, hard military logic, honed in the crucible of real-world conflicts, was a pragmatic approach to survival in the untamed West, where sentimentality often led to a quick grave. His inner conflict raged. His heart screamed for Blue, for immediate action to free his loyal companion. His training, however, whispered caution, advising a more strategic approach. If he went for Blue immediately, he risked being overwhelmed, jeopardizing not only his own life, but Blue's as well. The raiders, alerted by the commotion, would swarm him, and Blue would become collateral damage. This was the raw dilemma, the emotional pull versus the tactical imperative. He thought of the cultural belief among some Plains tribes that a man's spirit was intertwined with that of his animal companion, especially his dog. To lose one was to lose a part of oneself. This belief, while not his own, resonated deeply with the ache in his chest. Blue was more than a dog. He was the last living link to Jeremiah's shattered past, the final piece of his identity they had stolen. Silas, still barking orders, gestured towards the lean-to. "Hank, keep an eye on that hound. Don't want him making any more noise." His voice was a harsh command, oblivious to the fact that Blue's whimpers were a beacon, drawing Jeremiah closer. Jeremiah knew he had to disable their ability to pursue him. Their horses were already compromised, but they still had plenty of ammunition, and they knew the land. He needed to strike at something vital, something that would truly cripple their operations and force them to rethink their next move. The water barrel. It sat near the dwindling campfire, a large wooden barrel holding their precious supply. Without water, they would be forced to move, to expose themselves to become more vulnerable. The decision was made, a cold, hard choice that went against the immediate, burning desire to rescue Blue. It was a strategic retreat, a temporary deferment of his deepest wish for a larger, more impactful blow. The moral conflict was settled by the relentless logic of survival. He adjusted his position on the ridge, the Winchester feeling heavy and reassuring in his grasp. The sun was now fully above the horizon, washing the camp in a harsh, unforgiving light, but the shadows from the lean-to and the larger boulders offered some concealment. He sighted down the barrel, his aim true, his hand steady despite the gnawing hunger and thirst. He aimed not for the barrel's base, which would simply drain it slowly, but for the wooden staves near the top, where the impact would splinter the wood and cause the water to gush out rapidly, a dramatic and undeniable waste of their vital resource. It was an act of pure disruption, designed to infuriate and demoralize. The crack of the rifle shot was sharp and clear in the morning air, a stark declaration of his continued presence. The sound was immediately followed by the splintering crash of wood and a furious shout from the camp. Water, precious and life-giving, exploded from the barrel, spraying into the dry dust, creating a dark, rapidly expanding stain. Chaos erupted in the raiders' camp. Silas roared, Hank cursed, and the other men scrambled, staring in disbelief as their water supply vanished before their eyes. Their initial frustration quickly morphed into desperate anger, their focus now split between their missing water and the unseen threat that plagued them. Jeremiah watched, a grim satisfaction in his heart. They had taken his land, his dog, and his name. But he had just taken their lifeline, and the next move, he knew, would be theirs. The furious roars from the raiders' camp were music to Jeremiah's ears, a symphony of their unraveling frustration. The water, precious and vital, was soaking into the parched earth, a visible testament to his unseen presence. The sun, still high in the sky, seemed to mock their desperation, intensifying the brutal heat that would soon become their greatest enemy. Jeremiah, now a ghost in the landscape, began to descend from the ridge, his movements fluid and silent as a desert cat. He knew their next move. Thirst in the American West was a more potent driver than greed or fear. They would search for water, frantically, and their search would lead them to a place where he could exploit their panic. He remembered Grimm's chilling lesson on psychological warfare. A thirsty man makes mistakes, boy. A desperate man makes fatal ones. This was a fundamental truth of frontier survival, where water sources were often scarce and highly contested. The very real historical accounts of pioneers and prospectors dying of thirst in the arid lands underscored this brutal reality. He circled wide, using the natural contours of the land, the low ridges, the sparse clumps of mesquite, the dry arroyos, to remain unseen. He moved with a speed that belied his injured body, his mind a steel trap, anticipating their every move. The cool touch of the evening air would bring temporary relief, but the stolen water would not return. As darkness began to paint the sky in deep purples and grays, Jeremiah observed their camp from a new vantage point. They were in disarray, their earlier bravado replaced by a palpable sense of unease. Silas, the cruel-jawed leader, was barking orders, sending 2 men, Thorn and Hank, further east, likely towards a known waterhole miles away. Pike, the one who had stumbled earlier, was left with Silas, guarding the dwindling supplies and, most importantly, Blue. This division of forces was exactly what Jeremiah had hoped for. He was now operating on his terms, a hunter manipulating his prey. The moral conflict of whether to engage in direct conflict or use stealth had been resolved. The night was his ally, and he would use it to his full advantage. The frontier folklore of night demons or unseen avengers who struck under the cloak of darkness was no longer just a story. It was a reality he embodied. He watched Thorn and Hank ride off, their figures quickly swallowed by the deepening gloom. 2 gone. That left Silas and Pike, and Blue, his heart hammered, a silent drumbeat of grim determination. He waited until the last faint sound of the horses' hooves had faded into the vast silence of the desert night. Then Jeremiah began his infiltration. He moved towards the camp, not directly, but through the gnarled, thorny scrub that surrounded it. Each step was carefully placed, each breath controlled. He used the natural sounds of the night, the chirping of crickets, the rustle of a distant breeze, to mask any inadvertent noise he might make. He remembered Grimm's insistence on absolute silence, on becoming one with the shadows. He crawled on his belly at times, inching forward through the thorny undergrowth, feeling the sharp pricks of cactus spines against his skin, ignoring the discomfort. His injured ribs ached, a constant throb, but his focus was absolute. He was a phantom, unseen, unheard, a predator closing in on its unsuspecting quarry. The very air around him seemed to hold its breath, waiting for his move. He reached the edge of the camp, positioned behind a large, dark boulder that offered excellent concealment. Silas and Pike were huddled by the meager fire, their faces grim, their voices low and tense. Blue was tied to a short post nearby, a dark, matted shape in the flickering firelight. He whimpered occasionally, a soft, pathetic sound that tore at Jeremiah's heart. The sight of his loyal companion, injured and captive, fueled a cold, burning rage that threatened to consume him. He listened, straining to catch their words. They were arguing, their voices low and angry. "This ain't right, Silas," Pike muttered, his voice laced with fear. "Someone's out there. They're messing with us." Silas snorted. "Just some damn squatter holding a grudge. He ain't got the guts to face us proper." His bravado was a thin veneer, cracking under the pressure of the unseen threat. He believed in direct confrontation, a man-to-man fight, a common but often misguided belief in a West where cunning and ambush were equally potent weapons. Jeremiah watched as Silas reached for a bottle of whiskey, taking a long, desperate swig. He was losing his composure, resorting to the liquid courage that often dulled a man's senses and clouded his judgment. This was another weakness, a fatal flaw Jeremiah would exploit. The night was still young, and the hunter had just begun his deadly dance. The last embers of the raiders' campfire cast long, dancing shadows, distorting the figures of Silas and Pike huddled close, their conversation a low, tense murmur. The air, crisp with the chill of the desert night, carried the faint, rhythmic whimper of Blue, a sound that sliced through Jeremiah's carefully constructed composure. It was a beacon, pulling him forward, pushing aside the gnawing hunger and the aching pain in his ribs. He was closer now, close enough to make his move. He moved silently, a shadow among shadows, his path weaving through the sparse clumps of brush and the skeletal remains of dead mesquite. His military training had honed his ability to become virtually invisible in the dark, to move without disturbing a single pebble. He recalled Grimm's chilling words. "The night is your friend, boy. It covers your sins and hides your hand. Use it." This emphasis on nocturnal operations was a critical aspect of frontier warfare, where darkness often negated numerical superiority and favored stealth. He reached the edge of the camp, positioned behind a low ridge that offered perfect concealment. Silas and Pike were still arguing, their voices growing sharper with each swig of whiskey Silas took. Blue, a dark shape near the lean-to, whined again, a sound of profound distress. Jeremiah's heart ached with an almost physical pain. He watched Silas take another long swig, his movements becoming more sluggish, his words slurring. Pike, clearly unnerved by the unseen presence and Silas's deteriorating state, kept glancing nervously into the darkness beyond the firelight. He was tired, fearful, and his attention was divided. This was the opening Jeremiah needed. His plan was simple: disable Pike, then move on Silas. But first, he needed to confirm Blue's condition, to see if his loyal companion was too injured to be moved. The thought of Blue, defenseless and suffering, was a constant, searing moral conflict. Was he risking Blue's life by delaying, by adhering to a tactical strategy? Or was he ensuring Blue's safety by waiting for the opportune moment? The delicate balance between calculated risk and emotional impulse was a heavy burden. He eased himself closer, crawling on his belly, moving like a snake through the low-lying dust. He heard the rustle of Blue stirring, a faint scratching sound. He paused, listening intently. It sounded like Blue was trying to dig. He reached the lean-to, his hand outstretched, searching in the darkness. His fingers brushed against matted fur, and Blue whimpered, then a low, hopeful bark. Jeremiah froze, his heart pounding. "Easy, boy," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. Blue licked his hand frantically, a warm, wet reassurance. Jeremiah felt along Blue's body in the dark. He found the rope around his neck, chafing, but not tight enough to choke him. He found a deep cut on his left hind leg, still bleeding, and a swelling on his right foreleg. Blue was indeed injured, but not critically. He was weak, but his spirit was unbroken, and he was digging. Jeremiah's fingers found what Blue had been trying to uncover, a small, flat piece of rawhide half buried in the loose dirt. It was tied into a peculiar knot, a complex sequence of loops and twists that Jeremiah recognized with a jolt. It was a tracker's knot, a specific type of signal knot used by military scouts to leave messages for comrades, a highly specialized piece of frontier knowledge. Blue, in his desperation, had replicated a knot he had often watched Jeremiah tie, a silent, defiant message to his master. A profound realization washed over Jeremiah. Blue wasn't just waiting. He was actively aiding in his own rescue, communicating through the only means he had. This small, peculiar detail was a testament to the extraordinary intelligence and loyalty of his dog, a bond that transcended mere animal instinct. The cultural belief that animals possessed an almost human understanding, while often romanticized, felt undeniably true in this moment. His moral conflict vanished, replaced by a singular, unyielding purpose. Blue was not just a dog, he was family, and family on the frontier was defended with every last breath. The thirst, the pain, the gnawing hunger, all faded into the background. His focus narrowed to Silas and Pike, their fate now sealed by their cruel actions. The night was deepening, wrapping the camp in its cold embrace, and the hunter, no longer an unseen shadow, was about to emerge. A distant whinny, carried on the cool night air, announced the return of Thorn and Hank, their long ride to the distant waterhole a failure. Their horses, weary and lathered, stumbled into camp, their hooves scuffing loudly on the dry earth. Silas, startled from his whiskey-induced stupor, cursed, his voice thick with frustration. Pike, visibly relieved by the fresh faces, nonetheless looked increasingly strained. Jeremiah, still concealed near the lean-to, felt a tightening in his gut. His window of opportunity was shrinking. He had learned from Grimm that fear was a powerful weapon, but despair was even more potent. These men were beginning to unravel. Their thirst, their lack of success, and the unseen presence that toyed with them were eroding their resolve. The cultural belief in a cursed trail, where bad luck seemed to follow a group, might have been a dismissive thought to most, but for these men, already on edge, it would resonate. As Thorn and Hank dismounted, their faces grim, Jeremiah heard their frustrated reports. "Dry, Silas. Bone dry. Someone got there first or it just ran out," Hank grumbled, wiping sweat from his brow. The shared misery and the exhaustion of the futile ride created a tangible tension in the air. Silas roared, a primal sound of impotent rage. "Damn it! We need water! We can't stay here!" His eyes, bloodshot and frantic, scanned the darkness. His usual cold calculation was replaced by a desperate impulsiveness. This was the moment Jeremiah had been waiting for, the precise point where desperation would override caution. Just then, a figure emerged from the deeper shadows, a solitary rider silhouetted against the faint starlight. It was an old man, his face a roadmap of wrinkles, his eyes keen and wary. He rode a mule, its hooves making barely a sound. He was a local, a prospector perhaps, or a trapper, a man who knew the desert intimately. He had heard the gunshots, smelled the smoke, and come to investigate, drawn by the disruption of the wilderness's fragile peace. This was a common occurrence in the untamed territories, where independent frontiersmen often acted as informal wardens of their isolated domains. The raiders, startled by his sudden appearance, raised their rifles. "Who are you, old man?" Silas barked, his voice laced with suspicion. "What do you want?" The old man, unperturbed, simply dismounted, his movements slow and deliberate. He glanced at the water-soaked ground near the shattered barrel, then at the agitated raiders, his gaze lingering briefly on Blue. "Heard a ruckus," the old man drawled, his voice raspy, like dry leaves scraping on rock. "Thought I'd see what troubled the peace." He looked directly at Silas, his eyes unwavering. "This here land. She got a temper. Don't like being disrespected. Seen men try to take what ain't theirs out here. The desert always claims it's due." It was a cryptic warning, steeped in the cultural lore of the harsh, unyielding landscape, a belief that the land itself had a memory and a will. Silas, momentarily disarmed by the old man's calm demeanor and unsettling words, scoffed. "We ain't afraid of no desert superstitions, old man. We're just passing through, looking for water, and if you know where to find it, you best tell us." The old man's eyes flickered towards the north, a subtle, almost imperceptible movement that only Jeremiah with his trained eye would notice. "There's an old spring," he said, his voice quiet. "North, half a day's ride, but it's tricky. Gotta know the way, and the desert, she's got eyes." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the raiders, then settling for a moment on the hidden position of Jeremiah. "And ears." A slow burn of anger ignited in Silas's eyes. He didn't like being lectured, especially by an old prospector. "Get out of here, old man," he snarled, raising his rifle slightly, "before you find out how much temper we got." The old man simply shrugged, a subtle smile playing on his lips. "As you wish, but remember what I said. The land always claims its due." He slowly remounted his mule, his gaze lingering on Blue for a moment longer, a flicker of sympathy in his ancient eyes. Then he turned and rode off into the deepening darkness, leaving behind a profound unease in the raiders' camp. Jeremiah, observing the exchange, felt a surge of grim satisfaction. The old man's warning, a peculiar detail woven into the fabric of the frontier, had served its purpose. It had deepened the raiders' paranoia and, more importantly, confirmed his own belief that the land was a silent ally. The north, half a day's ride. It was a lead, a direction, and the old man's unsettling words, the subtle hint of eyes and ears in the desert, would further break down Silas's fraying composure. The moral conflict of using innocent people, even indirectly, in his pursuit of justice was fleeting. The old man knew the risks of speaking out. His words were a choice, a silent defiance of the raiders' aggression. The old prospector's warning, delivered with the dry wisdom of the desert, had settled like a stone in the raiders' already agitated minds. Silas, consumed by a thirst-driven fury, pointed north. "That spring," he snarled. "We get to it. Thorn, Hank, with me. Pike, you stay here, keep an eye on the camp. And that damn dog." His voice was tight with desperation, his usual cunning overshadowed by the immediate need for water. This was the opening Jeremiah needed. He watched them ride off, three figures swallowed by the vast, indifferent darkness, their horses' hooves kicking up faint dust. Pike, left alone with Blue, was clearly nervous, his rifle held loosely, his gaze darting into the shadows. He was a simpler man than Silas, more prone to superstition, and the old prospector's words had clearly unnerved him. This isolation was a deliberate tactic, a psychological maneuver to exploit Pike's fear and the cultural belief in the unseen forces of the wilderness. Jeremiah moved, not towards Pike, but in a wide arc, circling the camp. His target was no longer just the men. It was their supplies, their means of sustained operation. He remembered Grimm's lessons on logistics, on crippling an enemy by cutting off their resources. "A hungry man fights poorly, boy. A thirsty man don't fight at all." This strategy was a common military tactic, often employed in historical frontier conflicts to weaken an entrenched enemy before a direct assault. He reached the makeshift supply cache the raiders had established, a small pile of sacks and crates hidden beneath a canvas tarp near a cluster of rocks. The scent of coffee, bacon, and something else, gunpowder, reached him. Pike, engrossed in his own fear, was oblivious, occasionally muttering to himself, his attention divided between his captive and the unsettling darkness. Jeremiah worked swiftly, silently. He sliced open sacks of flour and sugar, spilling their contents onto the dry ground, mixing them with dirt and sand, rendering them useless. He pierced cans of preserved meat with his knife, letting the contents seep into the earth. He even poured out a small, emergency supply of water he found in a locked wooden box, the liquid splashing onto the dust with a soft hiss, a grim, ironic mirror to the water they had lost from the barrel. His moral conflict simmered. This was wanton destruction, an act of petty cruelty that mirrored their own. His father would have condemned it, seeing it as a descent into the very savagery they sought to escape. But Jeremiah's resolve was hard. These men had burned his home, crippled his dog, and stripped him of his name. This was not cruelty. It was a brutal, necessary act of attrition, a slow bleeding of their strength. The West, in its rawest form, often demanded such uncompromising actions, blurring the lines between justice and vengeance. He found a crate of ammunition, heavy and ominous. He couldn't destroy it all, but he could make it difficult for them to use. He pried open the lid with his knife, revealing rows of gleaming cartridges. He picked up a handful. Then, one by one, he drove the tip of his knife into the primer of each bullet, rendering them inert. It was tedious, painstaking work, but he continued with a grim satisfaction, each damaged cartridge a silent blow against his enemies. He thought of the thousands of rounds consumed during conflicts like the American Civil War, a testament to the destructive power of firearms, and now he was systematically disarming his foe. As he worked, he heard Pike cough, a nervous hacking sound. He was getting closer, perhaps checking on the supplies. Jeremiah froze, his movements absolutely still. He listened, straining to hear over the rapid thump of his own heart. Pike's footsteps grew closer, then stopped. Jeremiah held his breath, the knife poised over another bullet. "Everything all right over here, old man?" Pike called out, his voice wary, a forced bravado. He was peering into the shadows, his rifle raised. He didn't see Jeremiah, not yet. He saw only the dark, silent bulk of the supply cache. Jeremiah remained motionless, a part of the darkness. Pike hesitated, then slowly approached the cache, his eyes scanning the gloom. He reached out, his hand brushing against the canvas tarp. He tugged it aside, revealing the spilled flour, the pierced cans, the overturned water. "What in the hell?" Pike's voice rose, a raw cry of shock and disbelief. He dropped his rifle, his hands instinctively going to the ruined supplies, a pathetic gesture of futility. He stared at the destruction, his face contorted in a mixture of fear and dawning comprehension. Someone had been here. Someone silent. Someone with a purpose. Jeremiah watched, his heart a steady drum. Pike, bewildered and broken, was now completely vulnerable. The moon, now a pale disk, cast a stark light on Pike's face, revealing the full extent of his terror. The moral weight of the decision was gone, replaced by a cold, clear imperative. This was the end of the line for Pike. The desert night, once a cloak of silence, now echoed with Pike's strangled cry of disbelief, a sound quickly swallowed by the vast emptiness. He stood frozen amidst the ruined supplies, his rifle forgotten, his eyes wide with a terror that transcended the physical. He had faced armed men, but not a phantom, not an unseen force that moved with such silent, destructive purpose. This was a fear deeper than bullets, a psychological weapon that preyed on the superstition inherent in men who lived on the edge of civilization. The frontier, after all, was rife with tales of unseen spirits and avenging specters. Jeremiah emerged from the shadows, a silent figure in the pale moonlight, his own face grim and unyielding. He held the Winchester, not aimed but lowered, a silent declaration of his presence. Pike recoiled, stumbling backward, his breath catching in his throat. He saw not just a man, but the embodiment of his growing fear, a living nightmare that had systematically stripped them of their resources and their confidence. "You took everything." Jeremiah's voice was a low, gravelly rasp, barely a whisper in the vast night. "My land, my home, my dog." He let the words hang in the air, each one a hammer blow to Pike's already shattered resolve. Pike whimpered, shaking his head frantically. "I didn't. Silas? It was Silas. He burned it. He took the dog." He was a pathetic figure, broken and desperate, trying to deflect blame, to save himself. His moral conflict, if he possessed one, was now utterly consumed by his overwhelming fear. Jeremiah took a slow step forward, the rifle's stock bumping softly against his leg. Pike stumbled again, then turned and bolted, a clumsy, frantic dash into the darkness, leaving his rifle and the ruined supplies behind. He ran blindly, driven by a primal urge to escape the silent avenger he believed to be supernatural. Jeremiah watched him go, making no move to pursue. Pike was no longer a threat. He was broken, and he would carry the torment of that night with him, a living testament to the vengeance of the land. His own training, hard won in the crucible of military discipline, had taught him that sometimes the most effective weapon was psychological, breaking the enemy's will without shedding more blood than necessary. The lingering influence of his father's gentler wisdom, even in this brutal environment, perhaps manifested in this decision. He turned his attention back to the camp. Blue's whimpers were more frequent now, a desperate, plaintive sound that tugged at Jeremiah's heart. He moved swiftly towards the lean-to, his purpose clear, his resolve unwavering. The moon, now higher, cast long, distorted shadows, making the world seem a place of endless possibilities and hidden dangers. He reached Blue, who was tied tightly to a short, splintered post. The rope, rough and chafing, dug into the dog's neck. Blue, seeing him, whined, a low, guttural sound of recognition and profound relief. His tail thumped weakly against the dusty ground. Jeremiah knelt, his hands trembling slightly as he worked at the knot. "I got you, boy," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. The knot was tight, pulled taut by Blue's earlier struggles. He fumbled for his knife, pulling it from his belt. The blade, dull from neglect, cut through the rough rope with a satisfying snap. Blue was free. He nudged Jeremiah's hand, then licked his face frantically, a joyous, desperate greeting. Jeremiah buried his face in Blue's matted fur, feeling the warmth of his body, the frantic thump of his loyal heart. It was a moment of profound, quiet triumph, the first true solace he had felt since the fire. The reunion, a powerful cultural trope in Western narratives, symbolized a reclamation of humanity amidst brutality. He examined Blue's injuries in the pale moonlight. The cut on his hind leg was deep, but not bone-deep, and the swelling on his foreleg was concerning but not debilitating. Blue would heal. They both would. A low growl rumbled from Blue's chest, directed not at Jeremiah, but towards the deeper shadows beyond the lean-to. Jeremiah tensed, his grip tightening on the Winchester. Silas. He was here. He hadn't gone to the spring. He had stayed, listening, waiting. Silas emerged from the darkness, a rifle in his hand, his face a mask of furious determination. His eyes, though shadowed, glinted with a desperate, chilling resolve. He saw Jeremiah, and then he saw Blue, free and safe. A primal roar of rage tore from his throat. "You bastard! You thought you could take everything from me?" This was it. The final stalk. The ultimate confrontation. Jeremiah raised the Winchester, his injured ribs screaming in protest, but his hand was steady. His psychological conflict was over. All that remained was the hard, brutal truth of the West. 2 men, 1 gun, 1 dog, and a debt to be paid. The moon, now a stark, cold disk in the vast, indifferent sky, cast long, distorted shadows across the makeshift camp. Silas, a figure of desperate fury, lunged forward, his rifle coming up, a primal roar tearing from his throat. His eyes, burning with a mix of rage and disbelief, were fixed on Jeremiah and the newly freed Blue. This was the raw, unadulterated climax, the moment where all pretense of civilization was stripped away, leaving only the brutal calculus of survival. Blue, sensing the impending danger, let out a sharp, defiant bark, a warning that cut through the tension. He limped towards Jeremiah, pressing against his leg, a silent testament to his loyalty. Jeremiah's grip tightened on the Winchester, its cold steel a familiar comfort. His injured ribs screamed with every breath, but the pain was a distant thrum beneath the cold, clear focus of his mind. The moral conflict which had weighed on him for so long had dissolved into the stark reality of the present. This was not about revenge. It was about ending the threat, about protecting the last piece of his shattered life. Silas fired, the shot tearing through the night with a deafening crack. The bullet whizzed past Jeremiah's ear, kicking up a spray of dust from the ground behind him. He didn't flinch. He had faced fire before, under a different sun, in a different war. He remembered Grimm's chilling lesson on rifle fire. "Don't aim for the man, boy. Aim for the center mass. He ain't got no soul there." This brutal pragmatism, a hallmark of military training, often simplified the moral complexities of combat. Jeremiah returned fire, not aiming to kill, not yet. His shot struck the dirt inches from Silas's boot, sending up a geyser of dust and forcing the leader to dance back, his face contorted in a mix of surprise and renewed fury. It was a warning, a declaration that the hunted was now the hunter, and the tables had turned. Silas, momentarily thrown off, recovered quickly. He was a seasoned killer, accustomed to such exchanges. He ducked behind a gnarled mesquite tree, using its sparse branches for cover, and fired again, aiming more deliberately this time. The bullet thudded into the ground near Blue, who yelped, startled, and pressed closer to Jeremiah's legs. "Stay down, boy," Jeremiah murmured, pulling Blue behind him, using his own body as a shield. The sight of Blue in danger ignited a cold, burning fury in his gut, replacing any lingering hesitation. Silas had threatened the one thing he had left. That debt would be paid in full. He moved, not running, but a fluid, controlled advance, using the scattered rocks and low brush as cover. He was a phantom in the moonlight, his presence hinted at by the subtle rustle of disturbed leaves, the faint scrape of his boots on the dry earth. He remembered Grimm's emphasis on reading the ground, on understanding how terrain could offer both concealment and strategic advantage. The frontier, with its diverse and often unforgiving landscapes, demanded this keen spatial awareness. Silas, frustrated by Jeremiah's elusive movements, began firing wildly, his shots tearing through the night, echoing off the distant hills. He was losing his composure, his desperation growing with each wasted shot. He was accustomed to prey that ran, that cowered. Jeremiah was neither. This psychological torment was a peculiar detail of the conflict, as unsettling as any physical wound. Jeremiah reached a large, jagged boulder, its dark mass offering solid concealment. He peered around it, assessing Silas's position. The leader was reloading, his movements frantic, his hands fumbling slightly in the dim light. This was his chance. He brought the Winchester to his shoulder, his aim true. He thought of his burned home, of the stolen cattle, of the painful days and nights spent tracking, of the fear in Blue's eyes. He thought of his father, of the gentle life they had built, now reduced to ash. And then he thought of Grimm, his face stern and unyielding, his voice barking, "Finish it, boy. Don't let 'em breathe." The cultural belief in frontier justice, a harsh, often final form of retribution meted out by individuals in the absence of law, was not merely a concept for Jeremiah. It was a living, breathing imperative. He was not just a man fighting for his dog. He was the embodiment of the unforgiving West, a force of retribution against those who dared to violate its unspoken codes. He squeezed the trigger. The shot was precise, surgical. It struck Silas in the shoulder, tearing through flesh and bone, spinning him around with a choked cry. His rifle flew from his grasp, clattering uselessly on the rocks. Silas stumbled back, clutching his bleeding shoulder, his eyes wide with shock and a dawning, agonizing realization. He had underestimated the broken man, the quiet rancher, and now he would pay the ultimate price. Silas crumpled to the ground, a guttural roar of pain tearing from his throat, his rifle clattering uselessly on the rocks beside him. He clutched his shoulder, blood already seeping through his fingers, staining the dry earth a dark, viscous red. His eyes, wide with shock and agony, fixed on Jeremiah. The moon, now high above, bathed the scene in a cold, unforgiving light, revealing every detail of his utter defeat. Jeremiah stood over him, the Winchester still in his hand, its barrel glinting. Blue, his tail giving a tentative wag, nudged his leg, then let out a soft whine, sensing the shift in the balance of power. The moral conflict that had defined Jeremiah's pursuit for so long had finally reached its brutal resolution. He had avenged his home, reclaimed his dog, and shattered the arrogance of the man who had taken everything. Silas writhed, his breath coming in ragged gasps. You bastard," he choked, his voice weak. "You burned everything." He still believed Jeremiah was behind the fire, a desperate attempt to grasp at some form of righteous indignation, even in defeat. "You burned my home," Jeremiah corrected, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "You took my dog. You took my name." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "And you paid the price." The concept of retribution was a harsh reality of the frontier, a system of justice often enacted personally when formal law was absent. He looked at Silas, truly looked at him, and saw not just the cruel leader, but a man broken by his own greed and recklessness. The sight brought no joy, only a profound weariness. His father's gentle spirit, a lingering echo from a lost time, whispered of mercy, of a peace that came from not descending to the level of one's enemies. But Grimm's voice, harsher and more pragmatic, reminded him of consequences, of ensuring that a threat was truly neutralized. Jeremiah made a decision. a final act that would solidify his reclamation of self. He wouldn't kill Silas, not directly. The West was full of cruelties, and a wounded man left to the indifferent mercy of the desert often faced a fate far worse than a quick death. He knew Thorn and Hank would eventually return, probably leading Silas to whatever fate awaited him, likely a slow, agonizing trek through the waterless plains. This was a moral choice, a demonstration that he was not solely driven by vengeance, but by a colder, more calculated form of justice. He walked over to where Silas's revolver lay, its metallic sheen dulled by dust. He picked it up, spun the cylinder, and then, with a sharp, decisive movement, he emptied its chambers, scattering the bullets into the dust. He did the same with Silas's rifle, removing its cartridges. The weapons, now inert, were useless. "The desert takes what it's owed," Jeremiah stated, his voice a low, gravelly rasp, echoing the old prospector's words. It was a cultural belief that recognized the unforgiving nature of the land, a force that balanced scales in its own brutal way. He then turned his attention to Blue. He knelt beside his loyal companion, gently examining the dog's injured leg. The cut was deep, but would heal. The swelling on his foreleg would eventually subside. Blue licked his hand, his eyes filled with an unburdened affection that cut through Jeremiah's grim resolve. This was the true prize, the purpose that had driven him through the darkness. He secured Blue's harness, checking for any other injuries. The dog leaned into him, a warm, comforting weight. The simple presence of his loyal companion was a balm to his raw, aching soul. He had reclaimed his identity, not in the name he once bore, but in the unwavering bond he shared with this creature. Jeremiah Stone, the rancher, was gone, but the man who would walk through fire for his dog, that man had survived. He looked back at Silas, who lay groaning, clutching his shattered shoulder. The scene was stark, a testament to the brutal realities of the frontier. The sun would soon rise, bringing with it the relentless heat and the harsh, indifferent judgment of the desert. Jeremiah felt a profound sense of closure, not of celebration, but of a heavy, necessary task completed. The air was thick with the scent of dust and fading blood, and the only sound was Blue's soft breathing, a rhythm of quiet, hard-won survival. The first rays of dawn, sharp and unforgiving, began to slice across the mesa, revealing the full extent of the night's brutal work. Silas lay groaning, a broken figure against the pale earth, his breathing ragged, the wound in his shoulder stark against his grimy shirt. Pike was a distant, fleeting memory, lost to the terror of the wilderness. Thorn and Hank, returning from their fruitless search for water, would soon find their leader, and the grim testament to Jeremiah's vengeance. The air, still cool from the night, held the faint scent of copper and dust, a quiet lingering of the violence. Jeremiah watched the horizon, Blue a warm weight leaning against his leg. The dog whined softly, nudging his hand, a silent request for comfort. He ran a hand through Blue's coarse fur, the simple act a tether to the gentle life they had lost. The physical pain in his ribs was a dull ache, but the deeper, more profound cost of his actions settled over him. The stark reality of having taken lives, of having embraced the brutality he once sought to escape. The moral conflict of whether justice justified savagery had been answered, but the answer left an indelible mark. He knew what would happen. Thorn and Hank would return, find Silas, and the story would spread. Not just the story of a rancher burned out, but the legend of the silent, avenging figure who moved like a ghost, crippling men and leaving them to the mercies of the desert. The frontier, perpetually hungry for tales of both heroism and horror, would weave a new thread into its tapestry of folklore. The cultural belief in desert justice, where the vast, unforgiving land itself was seen as a judge and executioner, would find new testament in this narrative. He imagined the whispers around campfires. He lost his land, his dog, his name, but not his training. The phrase would follow him, a shadow stretching from his past, defining his future. He had wanted to reclaim his name, Jeremiah Stone, the rancher. But the ranch was ash, and the man who had walked through the fire was no longer that simple identity. He was a different being, forged in the crucible of loss and retribution, forever changed by the choices he had made. He felt a profound sense of emptiness. Not the despair of defeat, but the quiet hollow that comes after a battle is won and the cost is tallied. The satisfaction of triumph was fleeting, replaced by the heavy weight of what he had become. The sun, now fully risen, cast long, stark shadows behind them as they began to move, heading west, away from the scene of their reckoning. Blue limped, but his tail wagged with a quiet determination. He glanced up at Jeremiah, his eyes full of an uncomplicated trust. He was a constant living reminder of what truly mattered, what had been worth fighting for. The loyalty of the dog, a central theme in many Western stories, served as a profound contrast to the perfidy of men. Jeremiah scanned the landscape, his eyes seeing not just the vast expanse but the unseen trails, the hidden dangers, the subtle shifts in the wind. His military training, once a forgotten skill, was now an ingrained part of him, a perpetual vigilance that would likely never fade. He was a man without a home, without a name, but with a renewed purpose and a loyal companion. The land stretched before them, indifferent and eternal, offering no easy answers, only the endless, winding path of survival. He didn't look back. There was nothing left but ash and a new legend being born. The dust, disturbed by their passing, settled slowly, erasing their tracks, leaving the mesa to its silent, ancient solitude. The wind carried their scent away, and the sun rose higher, marking the beginning of a new, uncertain chapter. The dry wind, a tireless sculptor of the western plains, had already begun to erase their tracks. Jeremiah, with Blue limping faithfully by his side, rode west, towards the setting sun and the promise of a horizon unburdened by the ghosts of his past. The cabin, a dark speck against the vastness, receded behind them, a monument to a life devoured by flame and violence. He hadn't looked back. There was nothing left but ash and a new, unspoken chapter. His name, Jeremiah Stone, the rancher, was now a whisper in the dust, a memory buried with his home. He was simply a man, stripped of everything but his loyalty to his dog and the grim, precise skills forged in a forgotten war. Blue, his presence a constant, comforting weight against his leg, was the last tangible link to the peaceful existence that had been so brutally torn from him. The dog's occasional whimper, a reminder of his injured leg, spurred Jeremiah onward, a silent pact of survival and companionship. The journey was long, punctuated by the relentless heat of the day and the biting cold of the desert nights. They moved through vast stretches of untouched wilderness, across sun-baked flats and through jagged, silent canyons. Jeremiah, relying on his training, found water in hidden springs and meager seeps, sustained himself on what little game he could snare or hunt, and nursed Blue's injuries with rudimentary care. His former life as a rancher, with its predictable rhythms, was a distant dream. He was a survivor now, honed by hardship, living on the raw edge of existence. He thought of the other raiders, Thorne and Hank, returning to find Silas wounded and abandoned, their supplies ruined, their horses compromised. They would have picked up Silas, a broken man, a living testament to Jeremiah's vengeance. He imagined their fear, their growing paranoia as they realized the unseen hunter was no phantom, but a relentless force. The stories would spread, distorted and exaggerated, forming the legend of the silent avenger who walked the plains, a grim figure of retribution. The cultural folklore of the man-turned-wolf, a motif in many Native American narratives, spoke of a transformation through the hardship that Jeremiah had, in his own way, undergone. He often rode at night, guided by the stars, the immense, silent panorama of the cosmos a humbling backdrop to his solitary quest. He found a peculiar solace in the vast emptiness, a mirror to the quiet strength he had discovered within himself. The moral conflicts that had plagued him, the choice between vengeance and mercy, between the rancher and the warrior, had, in their crucible, forged a man of unyielding will and cold, clear purpose. He carried the burden of his actions, the knowledge of lives taken, but he also carried the fierce, unwavering loyalty to Blue, a beacon that guided his every step. They skirted small, burgeoning settlements, their lights flickering like distant fireflies. Jeremiah avoided them. The world of men, with its laws and its greed, no longer held an appeal. He preferred the raw, honest truth of the wilderness, where survival was a simpler, more direct proposition. He was not seeking a new home, not yet. He was seeking a new path, an undefined future where he could exist on his own terms, unburdened by the expectations of society or the demands of a name. Blue, now walking with less of a limp, would occasionally look up at him, a silent question in his intelligent eyes. Jeremiah would simply pat his head, a gesture of reassurance that transcended words. They were a unit, two souls bound by shared loss and an unbreakable bond, moving as one against the vast, indifferent backdrop of the western frontier. The very land seemed to hold its breath, watching their silent journey. The sun dipped below the horizon again, painting the sky in fiery hues that melted into the soft velvet black of night. Jeremiah rode on, his silhouette merging with the deepening shadows. He was a ghost on the plains, a whisper of a legend, a testament to the fact that some things once taken could be reclaimed, not always in their original form, but in a new, harder, more enduring truth. He was no longer Jeremiah Stone, rancher. He was the man who had lost everything, but not his training and not his dog, and that, he knew, was enough to face whatever the endless, unforgiving West had yet to offer. The last embers of the sun surrendered to the encroaching night, bleeding across the vast western sky in streaks of tired orange and deep, bruised indigo. The mesa, now swallowed by shadow, stretched endlessly, silent and indifferent. A lone coyote howled, a mournful, drawn-out cry that spoke of profound emptiness, not just of the land, but of the human heart that sought solace within its boundless embrace. The wind, which had carried whispers of violence and survival throughout the day, now softened to a gentle sigh, rustling through the sagebrush like a collective breath held and released. The cabin, small and isolated, was a dark silhouette against the fading light, its mended door a silent sentinel. No smoke curled from its chimney, no lamplight flickered from its windows. It was an empty vessel, a monument to a life once lived, a battle hard won, and a departure made in the quietude of resolve. The air grew cooler, carrying the crisp scent of night-blooming cereus and the faint, lingering metallic tang that only the desert could hold. The stars, one by one, began to prick through the deepening blue, vast and indifferent, bearing witness to stories untold and paths unfollowed. He was gone, like a fleeting shadow, like bootprints on a trail no one walks anymore. The desert, unforgiving and all-consuming, had taken him back, not in defeat, but in quiet triumph. Would you have chosen differently, if it was your hand on the blade, your peace at stake, and your past whispering its brutal truths in the face of insurmountable odds? The silence that stretched across the mesa was the only answer, a profound, lingering question echoing through the vast, empty heart of the American frontier.